Hi, Lauren. Thank you so much for joining me. How are you doing today?
Hi, Chloe. Yes, I'm all right, thank you. A little bit frazzled. I had a slightly early start from my toddler, but otherwise great and happy to be here.
Thank you. Yeah, so good to chat to you. I've followed you for a while. You've been on my radar, not only as a writer, but as someone with amazing hair that I've just always
Oh,
admired from afar.
not today. This is day three hair. This is badly in need of a wash,
Oh,
but
it's
thank you.
fabulous. It's lovely. Yeah, I normally just ask guests to tell us a little bit about what it is that you do and how you got to where you are today.
So I'm a writer, sometimes journalist. I'm an author. I'm currently writing fiction. So my next novel, Probably Nothing, is about to come out in 2 weeks. 2 weeks today, in fact, when we're speaking. So I'm currently a sort of big bundle of neuroses walking around. Yeah, preparing for publication. But I also write about fashion. I wrote a book called How to Break Up with Fast Fashion a few years ago. So I focus on sustainability and ethics in fashion, but also the psychology of fashion, how clothes make us feel, sometimes, our best selves, sometimes not so great. And I write about feminism, culture, travel, food, anything else really. And I've pretty much always done that. I've kind of been a writer since I was a teenager. And yeah, I've been self-employed for a long time as well. So I'm currently in that position where I don't feel like I could go back into sort of corporate office life, even if I wanted to. It can be a bit lonely, a bit isolating, but I do love it as well.
Yeah, love that. And you've got a new book coming out. I think it's in a few days, isn't it? And it will be published by the time this podcast comes out. It's called
Mm.
Probably Nothing. Can you share a bit about what that's about?
Yeah, it is a book about people pleasing, health anxiety, the wellness cult or craze, and a lot of other things. I mean, yeah, it's a novel that I initially thought was going to be mostly addressing what it's like to live as somebody who's constantly worried about their health. But actually, as soon as I started writing it, I realized that the concept really lent itself to people pleasing as well. So the protagonist is Bryony. She's in her early 30s. She's been hooking up kind of casually and sporadically with a guy that she met on a dating app. And she's realized that she's not really into him and she decides she doesn't want to see him again. And then she gets a phone call to say that he's died. And it turns out that he has been telling all of his friends and family that they're a serious couple and she's the love of his life. And because she's an enormous people pleaser, or some might say this is just what anyone would have to do in this situation, she goes along with it. She goes along with the charade. She can't bear to tell his poor grief-stricken family that, she wasn't really that into him. And so she allows herself to get kind of sucked into the world of his slightly eccentric family. She goes to the funeral. She, starts kind of attending lots of family functions back in his home village, and she can't really see a way to extricate herself from the situation. So it's been called a cautionary tale for people pleasers. It's essentially about how far that sort of awkwardness and desperate need to be liked and to be polite in all situations can take you.
And it's very, very funny, and very relatable as someone who is I call myself a recovering people pleaser. I definitely still struggle with people pleasing in lots of ways. So many descriptions that are like, oh my gosh, that is just so like I either know someone like that or notice that in myself. And I wrote a blog post about people pleasing a week or so ago, and I was reflecting on some of the things that I've done for people pleasing. I remember having a hairdresser who offered me a hand and arm massage in the, as the color was setting. And I turned it down. And I always think about that as like an example of like, I'd be too polite to even, I love massages, like hand massage is my idea of heaven, basically. But I couldn't accept that because I was being too polite. And it's little things like
Yeah.
that. But is that something, I know this is such a, I don't know, I think women get asked this question when you write a book, like how much of yourself have you put into that? But is that,
Oh, so
do you
much.
relate to that people pleasing?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, honestly, I don't think I could have written this book if it wasn't a big part of my own personality. And yeah, it's interesting. I think women do get asked that question more than men, but at the same time, I'm sort of learning with fiction. I don't think I could write a protagonist that didn't have elements of myself
Yeah.
in them because, of course, every thought that occurs in a protagonist's head has to have occurred in my head first, you know, like I've got to have dreamt it up in order to be able to write it down. So I think inevitably it's always going to reflect certain elements of my experience, my personality. And people pleasing is definitely a big part of mine. I wish I could say I'm recovered. I think I'm very much still going through it, still sort of learning, I guess, about all the different ways in which people pleasing kind of manifests itself in my life. And I know that, you know, often your guests are experts who've written really helpful non-fiction guides to help people sort of with their mental health. Whereas as a fiction author, I think what I've done is very much more an exploration of how it feels to be kind of right in the thick of those problems without necessarily having any answers yet, although I'm sort of working towards it. But yeah, I definitely identify as a people pleaser. I am one of those people that I think, because I'm a bit of an extrovert as well, and I think that's interesting. I think we've talked a lot about introverts in culture recently in recent years. Um, but I think people pleasers and extroverts have something in common, which is that we really need everybody else to be having a good time all the time.
Mm.
And we feel very responsible for other people's happiness. And I'm that person where if you go out for dinner and somebody else at the table doesn't really like their food, or there's a bit of a draft, or the music's too loud, it will ruin my day. You know, I will be lying in bed hours later thinking, oh my God, if only I'd, you know, chosen a different place. Or I tend to really shoulder the responsibility for everybody else's happiness all the time in a way that I don't think is necessarily that selfless. You know, I think that's something I've tried to cover a lot in the book, is that people pleasing doesn't necessarily make you a good person. It doesn't necessarily mean that you are altruistic or generous any more than the person who isn't a people pleaser. There's a lot more kind of self-interest in it. I know that's something that you've covered a lot brilliantly on this podcast as well.
It's so fascinating. And I sometimes think that the most helpful thing for this sort of thing, like people pleasing, is not like take these 3 steps and you're going to overcome it. It's hearing stories, it's hearing examples and highlighting that this is what that is, because there'll be people listening, I'm sure, that think to themselves, oh, I do that. Like, of course. Like, and I was thinking as you were speaking, I've had horrible birthday parties because I brought groups of people together and I've just been stressed about them all getting along. Is everyone okay? And that's that kind of reminder to me of, oh, that's interesting. Maybe that's something I need to sort of pay attention
Yeah.
to. I think just highlighting it is so valuable, and hearing those stories and examples is so valuable.
Yeah, because it's really insidious. And I think a lot of the time we don't even notice it's people pleasing. We just think that it's natural. And it's quite funny. The reaction I've had to the book is one of my early readers, Ella, messaged me and she was like, controversial opinion, but I don't think she did anything wrong. I think that the only thing she could have done in that situation was lie and go along with the charade and pretend that she'd been madly in love with this guy. And I was like, yeah, do you know what? Same. Like, even having written the book, and there is progress in the book, she does go on a journey, you know. Um, but even having written that book, I'm still kind of like, what else could she have done? Like, where was the point in the book where she should have said, oh, do you know what? Actually, I'm really sorry, but he was just a kind of casual hookup and I didn't really like him that much. Um, but I know that there will be people who will read it and they will be screaming at the protagonist that, you know, these are all the points at which she should have hopped off that path and been honest. Um, yeah, I think it's very ingrained. I think particularly as women, I think there's all kinds of different things that are a factor. I'm an eldest daughter as well, and I know that the internet has had a lot of
Same.
discourse around eldest daughter syndrome. Right. And you know what's interesting is that a lot of my closest friends, I would say the majority of my closest friends are all eldest daughters. And I think there's something about that. We kind of, it's a kinship, and we know what it is to be the leader, the person that has to go first, the person that maybe does worry about everybody else. And that's something that I'm sort of trying to examine a little bit as well. But it's hard. Yeah, it's really hard to break the
Yeah,
habit.
yeah. And I love that point you made about how there is something with people pleasing whereby you kind of feel like you're being really kind, you feel like you're being,
Mm,
you're putting other people first, and sometimes there can be this thing about almost feeling resentful when that's not reciprocated, but no one asked you to, stress out and put your needs aside and look after other people. And then we can get resentful. And so there's all sorts of things where people pleasing actually doesn't really serve anyone. It actually can be a problem in our
absolutely.
relationships big time.
It's so true. I've written a piece actually for a newspaper that's going to kind of accompany the book about people pleasing and kind of extreme examples of people pleasing. And one of the points that I made in that is that people pleasing actually often really affects our friendships negatively, I think, because you end up in these situations where either you have a very imbalanced friendship where you feel like you're putting all the effort in and you're not really getting it back, as you say, it doesn't feel fair, it doesn't feel reciprocal, you're always the one making the effort and, you know, traveling miles to see that person or kind of reaching out and trying to make plans with them. Or the opposite is true, and you end up, and this is true of Bryony in the book, you end up with a few too many friends potentially because you have no idea how to say no to anyone. You don't know how to let people down. And then you're the bad friend because you're the one that doesn't have time to reply to all the messages and go to all the birthday drinks and remember everybody's, you know, everything, because you've just taken on too much. And actually, at some point along the line, you should have just said, do you know what? You're lovely, but actually, I just can't go for coffee because I've kind of got a full enough life. And
Yeah.
I've experienced both of those, I think. And people pleasing does get us into these kind of stitches where, yeah, you're right, you do end up a little bit bitter and resentful because you're not getting back what you're putting in, but nobody asked you to.
Yeah, gosh. Another thing that you talk about is Bryony being a perfectionist overachiever.
Mm,
And I would say probably in the clients that I work with, that is a theme that comes up a lot. They're kind of anxious overachiever, putting loads of pressure on themselves, overworking, worrying about everything. Could you say a bit about that? And is that something that you relate to as well?
100%. Yes, very much so. I'm a perfectionist to the point where it kind of ruins things sometimes. So, like, one example is whenever we go on holiday, I need every meal to be amazing. You know, I can't just go, there's a perfectly fine looking cafe, let's just stop and have a sandwich because we're hungry. It has to be, you know, the best reviewed, the hidden gem, the place that everybody raves about. And even if we have to walk for an hour and we're angry and hot, and then we get there and they don't have a table, and then that will ruin my day. I hype everything up. Everything has to be perfect. And that's something I've always struggled a bit with. Yeah. And often I think perfection anxiety as well goes hand in hand with that. So I know that I'm definitely guilty of not doing things because I'm nervous they won't be good enough. So, particularly in my professional life, I've been having a bit of a creative block recently, and I find it, you know, hard to overcome that fear that I'll sit down and write something and it just will be a bit rubbish. And not worth doing. And I think that's, you know, it's not ideal for a writer because everybody knows first drafts are meant to be bad and you have to sort of power through. So that's definitely something I identify with. And I think a lot of it probably comes from school. You know, I
Mm,
think I'm sure lots of people will identify with when you're at school and if you are, you know, relatively academic and you kind of take on that pressure to do everything perfectly to get the perfect grades and you work really, really hard. And I don't think it helped that I went to an all-girls school, so there weren't many distractions and it was quite a culture of
mm,
high achieving. And you carry that through your life. I think it's quite hard to leave that behind.
yeah.
And yeah, Bryony definitely suffers from that in the book, and I think that kind of goes hand in hand with her people pleasing because she really needs every situation to be perfect, and she needs to optimize everything. Um, and there's another protagonist, Kelly, who doesn't feel that way at all and is much more self-assured, I think, and much kind of has a much stronger sense of her own identity and her own selfhood. And I thought it was quite interesting to kind of contrast those two characters and show that there are different ways of being. And actually, it's not the default, although a lot of us feel like it is because we surround ourselves probably with people that are quite similar to us.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's a great point about, I often think about how perfectionism is very reinforced in our society. Like it's praised. Like I'm sure people say to you, how amazing you found that amazing restaurant. Like, please give me your recommendations. Like Lauren always does stuff so well, like it gets praise. And so it can be like a something that gets reinforced, you know, from a young age. You know, you're getting good grades, your parents are really pleased, you got attention for it. And so yeah, it can be really hard to move away from that. I was thinking about when you were talking a meme that was something like, no one talks about the trauma of like the gifted and talented program. Did you have a gifted and talented program in school where if
I
like you
don't
were
know. I don't think we did, but yeah, I can definitely identify with it. I think the
it
kind of
was
class
like
that I was in, my friends were sort of our own little
yeah, or like the
gifted
top set or
program,
something,
although
or
that's
the
very arrogant to say.
yeah.
Yeah.
We had something in my school, like we called it the SWAT award or something, which was like an award you got for getting like good grades, and it was all like this
Mhm.
competitive thing. But yeah, definitely, yeah, I understand that thing of coming from school and can see how being in an all-girls school, maybe that would be, the perfectionist tendencies maybe that we have more as women, uh,
Mm.
could exacerbate that, definitely.
Yeah, and just no boys to kind of focus on. You know, I think had I gone to a covered school, I probably would have got worse grades, but I would have been a maybe a sort of slightly better rounded person.
Right. Yeah,
um,
interesting.
yeah.
Yeah. Could we talk a bit about health anxiety? And again, I have had my experiences with health anxiety, probably worse when I used to drink a lot of alcohol, like in my teens and early 20s. And
Mm.
when you're hungover and your body feels weird, you've got weird sensations and tingles and things. And I would sometimes spend like whole days just in a horrible, anxious state, thinking that I had something terrible going on with my body. What's been your experience with health anxiety?
So I have had health anxiety, I think my entire life, as far back as I can remember. So even when I was really little, I had this tendency whenever, if my family ever went out for a meal, which we didn't do very often, but um, I would always start feeling nauseous at the table. I would always think I was going to be sick. And then my poor mum would have to spend the entire time in the toilets with me, letting her food go cold. And then we would end up going home. And as soon as we got home, I would be absolutely fine again. And that is something I've kind of carried through my entire life. My anxiety manifests itself in a very physical way.
Mm,
And so it becomes a bit of a chicken and egg syndrome because on the one hand, people think of health anxiety or hypochondria, which is its sort of, more colloquial name. They think of it as being somebody worrying all the time that they're ill or exaggerating their symptoms. But I think what people don't realize is that actually, if you have health anxiety, a lot of the time you feel ill. It's a very physical and very real kind of experience. So for some people, I guess if you have a panic attack, it's about the breathing, or it's sort of you feel woozy and dizzy. For me, I feel like I'm going to puke,
mm,
unfortunately. And I also have something called a metaphobia, so a kind of quite debilitating fear of vomiting. So those two
mm,
don't really help either. And I've always experienced it to sort of some degree. It gets worse, I think, during stressful periods. I remember when I was a student, I think particularly when I was going through my finals, I had all these incidents of being convinced that I was dying of something. And my flatmates took me to A&E once. Um, and like just very sweetly kind of bundled me up into a taxi and took me to the hospital and sat with me for hours until a doctor kind of did all the tests and all the examinations and said, there's nothing wrong with you. You're just having a panic attack. Um, and I've always been, yeah, like I think Dr. Google makes things worse. But even when I was younger, there's an anecdote I've put in an article recently about the first time I saw Moulin Rouge and after I became convinced that I had consumption. And yeah, I just having watched like Nicole Kidman die from wearing a too tight corset or whatever, I was just convinced I couldn't breathe. And um, having a baby recently as well didn't help. So
mm,
pregnancy, as you know, it's impossible not to be hyper vigilant about your body because everyone's telling you to be. You're reading endless material about all the changes that are happening in your body. You're incredibly switched on to any tiny twinge or sensation that's unfamiliar. And of course, it's an experience that is full of unfamiliar sensations. Everything that's going on in your
mm,
body, you're thinking, that's weird, that's new, what the hell's that? And then you've got midwives and doctors saying, oh, it's normal, don't worry. And it's a really sort of discombobulating time for anybody, but I think particularly if you're someone that does worry disproportionately about their health. So I was just constantly on forums, Googling
mm.
absolutely everything. Took a lot of trips to the maternity triage, um,
Yeah.
just to check everything out. And then, of course, once you've had the baby, you've then got a whole other person to kind of worry about and their health. And is she okay? And is she breathing? And is her temperature normal? And what's that rash? And so it isn't something that's ever gone away, but I think it has definitely got easier the more that I've recognized it. And I remember the day that I first found the kind of NHS webpage for health anxiety. And that was really comforting, actually, to have a proper diagnosis, to have a phrase that I could put to what I'd experienced. Whereas I think
Mm,
before I'd always seen it as a sort of ridiculous and quite shameful thing, because hypochondriacs tend to be a punchline, don't they? In popular culture and in society, it's sort of the butt of a joke, and it's somebody kind of ridiculous, attention seeking
mm,
that just
mm.
is making it all up. But
Yeah.
actually realizing it is a proper facet of anxiety, and not one that I don't think is talked about that much. So it's part of the reason I wanted to put it in the book. Was I've read so much about anxiety in recent years, and I've seen so many more amazing heroines in culture that have anxiety, and that's brilliant. But I hadn't really seen any depictions of health anxiety that I could relate to. So I thought I would, try and attempt to write one.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's such an important point, that thing of, I don't know if it's in like episodes of Friends, or I can't remember, does Ross have hypochondria or something, and it's kind of made fun of, or one of the characters. And yet
Yeah,
when you are
yeah,
experiencing health anxiety, you literally like feel like you're dying. It is the
yes,
most serious, intense feeling you can get, basically. And having
yeah.
panic attacks, like you really feel like going into A&E is a very common occurrence for people with panic attacks,
Mm.
because you do feel like you're dying. And actually, to go through that, I think you've got to be it shows you're a strong person to go through that, because it is so, so horrible when you're
Yeah.
really in the throes of it.
It
Mm.
really is. And I think it's difficult because people will say better safe than sorry. It's always good to get these things checked out. It's always better to go to the doctor, which is absolutely true. But there's only so many hours in the day. And if I went to the doctor every single time I thought there was something wrong with me, I wouldn't never do anything else. So it
Mm,
does take
mm.
a certain amount of mental resilience to just sort of push on and go, okay, well, I do feel like I'm dying right now, but I'll just leave it half an hour
Yeah.
and I'll have a sandwich and I'll have a sit down and then hopefully it'll go away and I won't die today. But it is a constant battle.
Mm,
And yeah, I think the fact that we have so much more information in our society now is a double-edged sword. It's brilliant, and it probably means that many more people are getting diagnosed with genuine things. But it also means that there's this whole world of possibilities out there and loads of conditions that I hadn't even heard of. But all I need to do is type a couple of symptoms into Google, and then I'm panicking about one thing or another. Um,
mm, mm.
yeah, it's quite hard to get a handle on.
Yeah. And I definitely obviously know what you mean when you're pregnant, when you've got a new baby. I think that the one time that I did go into the triage to have my baby's like heartbeat monitored, was when my partner had gone away. And I think it was the only time he'd gone away for the weekend, the whole time I was pregnant. And I think it was the kind of like slight anxiety of having him be away, that made me like hyper aware of things. And I ended up having to get a taxi because he'd taken the car to the hospital in the middle of the night, and then everything was fine. And then waited for like an hour and a half for a taxi to get home at like 3 in the morning outside this
Oh,
hospital.
you
So
poor
that wasn't very
thing.
fun.
Oh, it's
But
so stressful. And
yeah, yeah.
superstition, I think, comes into it a lot. Do you think because there's that sense of like, oh, it would be the one time my husband's away that everything will
Mm,
go wrong, and
yeah,
I'm very
yeah,
much like
yeah.
that. I'm always, and I think people pleasing comes back into it. Whenever I feel ill, and there's a scene in the book, actually, I've sort of directly lifted these thoughts out of my own head and put them into Bryony's mouth. But whenever I feel ill, the place my brain often goes is, what will this ruin? And it's not even always a fear of the illness itself. It's more a fear of all the plans it's going to wreck, which sounds ridiculous, but I'll be going, oh my God, okay, well, if I've got norovirus right now, then that means I've got to cancel that thing tomorrow and I won't be able to go to that thing on Wednesday. And I'm going to let that person down and this person. And what if I pass it on to my husband? What if I pass it on to my daughter? And then that's going to ruin that thing at the weekend. And I will spiral. And that is often when I realize what a big people pleaser I am as well, because yeah, my immediate thoughts are always, well, I can't let people down. And I've got a
Yeah.
line in the book where Bryony's trying to explain it to a therapist, and she says, I'm not scared of dying. I'm scared of like having tickets to that thing on Tuesday and not being able to go. which sounds so
Yeah.
ludicrous. You put it on a page, but I hope that I'm not the only one that kind of thinks that
Mm,
way. Um,
Interesting, isn't it? Yeah, yeah. No, I'm sure lots of people will relate to that. Could we talk a bit about this thing of talking about pregnancy again, about the pressure when you're pregnant, and maybe it's more so when you work for yourself to kind of get everything done before this, I don't know when you stopped working, how many weeks you were, but for me it was 38 weeks, and that was too long. I wish I'd stopped working at 36 weeks because I was
mm,
in very uncomfortable. It was a heat wave, and I was just sat there like an absolute
oh,
hot, hot whale.
I
Um,
remember that heat wave because I was pregnant during that heat wave and it was
yeah,
horrible.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
truly awful. But yeah, there is this pressure to be productive, to get everything ready, to have the nursery completely decorated. And you see other people's Instagrams. I remember, I think I'm actually in the nursery now. It's now my office. It never turned into a nursery. But it wasn't ready. Ever, people's Instagrams were showing their amazing nurseries or their scheduled Instagram posts for the next 6 months or whatever. Can you share about your experience with that?
I absolutely can. So I was supposed to finish this book before the baby came, and I did not.
Mm,
I didn't even get close. And I had a solid block of about 6 months, from me sort of telling my publishers that I was pregnant to the baby coming. And I was like, look, I haven't really got any other work on. I will just block out my diary. I'm just going to focus on getting this draft done. 6 months should be plenty of time. I will hand it in just before I give birth. Bish, bash, bosh, perfect timing. Everyone's happy. And I just couldn't. It was like my brain turned to soft cheese. I found it so difficult to focus. Partly, I think it was a mental thing. I think it is much harder to focus when you're pregnant. And it's that difficult duality, isn't it? Where on the one hand, we're trying to argue that pregnancy is not a disability, and we shouldn't be discriminated against, and we can do everything that anyone else can do when we're pregnant. But then at the same time, the truth is actually often you can't because
mm,
your brain and your body are going through these enormous changes that you've got hormones pinging around all over the place, making you feel completely useless some days, completely crazy other days. Like it's a really difficult experience. And as well, I think you've actually got the logistics and the admin of being pregnant. No one prepared me for that. So I had a few complications in my pregnancy, like nothing serious in the end, but just things that they had to monitor. And I had to go in for a lot of extra scans, extra midwife appointments. I also had CBT during pregnancy to try and help me deal with a lot of the anxieties that pregnancy was bringing up. And then all of the other things you're supposed to do. So even just drinking enough water and getting enough exercise and taking your vitamins
mm,
and doing stretches and all the research you have to do and all of the, learning how to care for a baby and going to the classes and buying all the equipment and thinking about everything you have to do. It was really time consuming. And it
yeah.
just started to feel like being pregnant was my full-time job. And it was very hard to do my actual full-time job, which was trying to write a novel. So
Mm,
what happened in the end was I managed, I think, about half of the book. Um, and I sort of, in a, obviously, as you can imagine, flurry of apologies and anxiety and kind of worry that I was letting everybody down, I just sort of deposited what I had managed to write into my editor's inbox and then went off to have the baby. And then the result of that was that I ended up having to write the rest of the book with a newborn,
mm,
which is not ideal. And I wouldn't recommend it to people. And I probably wouldn't ever plan to do that again. But in some ways, I found it easier. Like my brain
mm,
kind of worked better,
yeah.
having had to, even though I was, enormously sleep deprived and still very hormonal, and it had all its own challenges. But yeah, and I still feel a kind of sense of shame, I think, that I just wasn't able to be more productive during pregnancy. And you're right, people kind of all over the place were doing these amazing things, and people were saying, oh my god, I used those last few weeks to reorganize the entire house, and I was nesting so hard that I was like labeling everything, and I kind of reorganized all the kitchen cupboards, and oh my god, I mean, I'm not that person even when I'm not pregnant, but I was so, yeah, I felt so useless. I felt so kind of pathetic that I just couldn't do anything. And I ended up going 10 days overdue. And I remember those overdue days, I felt so guilty every single day that I wasn't working. And
Mm.
I would like drag myself out, kind of hobble along to a coffee shop with my laptop and just sit there thinking, okay, come on, just do something, just get some words on the page, because you'll be glad that you did later on when you've got to come back to this. And it was just really difficult. I don't know, for whatever reason, my brain just wasn't really in gear.
Mm.
I would have
Yeah.
loved to have heard more people talk about that side of it, actually, so that I didn't feel quite so alone and quite so useless. Um, Rather than that kind of sense of like, yeah, having to get everything done and tick every box before the baby comes.
Yeah. It's interesting as well. I noticed that everyone says, you think you're tired now while you're pregnant, just wait till the
Oh,
baby comes. And I actually found that being pregnant was in some ways more tiring. It kind of like
mhm.
bone tiredness, like my body like feels like a lead weight kind of tiredness. Whereas sleep deprived tiredness is just a different flavor of tiredness, but almost found that harder to deal with than when the baby was there not sleeping sometimes. So I found that
Yeah,
interesting.
completely agree. And you've also got the guilt as well of thinking, well, I'm so lucky to be pregnant and I'm so
Mm.
grateful. I ought to be so excited. And that's something I've got in the book as well. I'm not going to reveal any spoilers, but there is a bit of a pregnancy plot line. And yeah, that was something I wanted to kind of explore a little bit, was that sense of feeling, on the one hand incredibly grateful and incredibly lucky and incredibly excited for your new life as a parent, but at the same time really not enjoying pregnancy and then feeling very guilty about that.
Mm. Yeah. I definitely remember, as someone as well who can feel guilty for not being productive and not working, the first 6 weeks, I was amazed at how little I could get done. Just even like putting washing on or like properly like washing my hair, or I wanted to write down the birth story and it took me 6 weeks to write it. I would write like a little bit like every few days or something because I just wanted to remember, what had happened. But I was amazed by how little time you have when you are, yeah, looking after a small baby. And I think we need to be kinder to ourselves about that and yeah, not expect anything of ourselves for the first few years, maybe. I don't know.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's like, if a friend said that to us, the advice we would give them is, oh my God, don't be ridiculous. Like, you're keeping a human alive. That's all you have to do. Just
Yeah.
forget everything else. But we're never as easy on ourselves as we are on other people, are we? And it's very hard to kind of remember that. And I mean, if it helps, so she's now 17 months old. I still don't have a baby book. I still haven't managed to write down anything really. I've written a few scribbled phone notes in the middle of the night. I still don't have, a beautiful book of photos and memories and things that she can look through when she's older. And I feel so bad about that, but I've just not managed to. And like any little pocket of spare time that you have, you just want to lie down and sleep or
Yeah,
watch telly. Yeah.
exactly, exactly. You mentioned there about CBT as something that you did while you were pregnant. Are there other things that you do to sort of take care of yourself or take care of your mental health or other things that have kind of helped you?
Probably not as much as I should, actually. I think that's definitely a sort of path I'm still on. I've done a lot of CBT in my life at various intervals, mostly focusing specifically on my emetophobia, actually, because CBT generally is kind of prescribed for phobias as the most effective form of treatment. I'd love to say that I'm cured. I'm not. I'm definitely better than I was. But I think it's tricky trying to access this stuff on the NHS, and it's also
Mm.
hard trying to find the funds to go private. That's always my thing. If I won the Euro Millions, I would just have loads of really amazing therapy. So yeah, I'm still sort of waiting for the day that I can invest really seriously in my mental health. But in
Mm.
terms of smaller things, I like to always try and wind down at the end of the day. I don't like to just sort of get into bed fresh from a screen or something. I always kind of read in bed generally. I make it about 2 pages and then the book falls on my face and I'm asleep. But something like that I try to do. Morning pages is another thing that I don't always do, but particularly when I'm working on a book, that tends to be my method. So I will get up early. I'm an early riser anyway. Even when my daughter sort of sleeps in a little bit later, I still tend to wake up at 5 on the dot, no matter what I do. So I kind of like to take that time for myself a little bit, and I will get up and sit down with a notebook and write something longhand. It's normally nonsense, but I'll just try and kind of scribble out a few pages of something that I can then go back to later in the day and start typing up, and that kind of helps. I think with my mental health, but also creativity. I think it just, eases me in rather than having to sit down and stare at a blank page on a laptop. Um, yeah, I think lots of time with friends and family, I find really
Mm.
sort of replenishes me. And that's something that's quite difficult when you are self-employed and you work from home and you're on your own a lot.
Yeah.
And a lot of my best friends live very far away. They're all in different towns, kind of across the country. So trying to kind of actually make time to check in with people. And I will, get on a train and travel 2 hours to have lunch with a friend and then travel 2 hours back again. And, some people would kind of, I think, shy away from doing that. But actually, I find that's really important for my mental health, not just seeing the friend, but also just getting 2 hours on a train to like read a book and stare out of the window kind of feels like luxury. Like that's my spa trip at the moment,
Yeah.
that's a spa thing to me.
Definitely.
Yeah. And talking things through as well. My husband and I are both quite big on like pouring out kind of all of our feelings and emotions to each other when we feel we need to. And I think that's something that, yeah, I'm never shy about holding back on how I'm feeling. I will just kind of let it all
Mm.
flood out, have a little bit of a
Yeah.
meltdown and feel better afterwards.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that, the morning pages idea. I did that for a while. I need to get back into that, but definitely relate to
Mm,
that thing of self-care is now just a shower solo or a
yeah,
long train ride to read a book or something. Definitely.
genuinely.
What is there something that you're, so this is a question I very often ask people. Is there something that you are struggling with at the moment? And what are you doing to kind of work through it or handle it? Or what's your kind of process with it at the minute?
So yeah, as I mentioned before, I'm having a bit of a kind of creative block that has been going on, I guess, since pregnancy, I think. And
Mm.
maybe even earlier, I think the pandemic definitely played a big part in it. And I know I'm not the only one that found it was very hard to be productive and to be creative when all that was going on. I did actually write my first novel during the pandemic, so I must have managed it, but it didn't feel like it was easy. It really felt like pulling teeth. And so, yeah, I'm kind of, my project at the moment is that I'm trying to sort of jumpstart my creativity and also get over that fear of things not being good enough.
Mm.
And the way that I'm doing that is I've just started a Substack, as many other people have. I feel like I'm kind of late to that party, but I want to try and encourage myself to just write something every week. And it doesn't have to be perfect. And I don't have to spend days and days editing it and polishing it and panicking over it. I just want to get something out. I just want to get some ideas out into the world. And I'm hoping that that will sort of like jumpstart my creative muscles a little bit. Um, and I think the knock-on effect of that with my mental health generally will just be that I stop beating myself up quite so much for being useless, because there's been a lot of that recently. I think what with, yeah, missing my first deadline for the novel, and it often feels like all around me, everyone is hustling all the time. Everyone's got a million side projects, everybody's starting their podcasts and, launching this and launching that and getting amazing book deals and going on tours. And, it's a very, I guess, the industry that we're kind of in is very quantifiable and very visual and performative. And you kind of really see everybody's achievements all the time. And it can be quite hard to sort of shut out that noise and remind yourself that things aren't
Mm.
necessarily always as rosy behind the scenes. But I also think that I'm never going to feel better unless I actually just write stuff, like stop looking at what other people are doing and sit down and try and create and sort of reconnect with the reasons that I love what I do and the reasons that
Mm.
I write, and it helps me make sense of the world. And I've just not been doing enough of it recently. So yeah, that's my plan, is just try and put something out there. And even if nobody reads it and nobody cares, I think that it will just serve me in a lot of ways and hopefully help me kind of get back into the rhythm of being a bit more creative on the daily, and not necessarily just because there's a deadline hanging over me and a paycheck to
Mm.
collect at the end of it.
Yeah. I'm so glad you shared that, because I think that's so permission giving to sort of other people listening who may be either, creative professionals themselves or wanting to be more creative and battling with those fears and the pressure and all of that. I think it's such a common experience. I speak to so many authors and writers who are these amazing writers, and yet that those fears are still there. It doesn't matter how many books you've got published, or that is still just part of the creative process for so many.
That's
So
it.
yeah, I
Never,
hope
it
people
just gets
listening.
in the way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so thank you so much for sharing all that you've shared. I think it's really just naming some of the things that people are experiencing and helping people to feel less alone, I'm sure. And yeah, I hope people are going to go out and buy your book. Can you share where people can find you, where they can get your book, and all that sort of thing?
Absolutely, yes. I am at Lauren Bravo on pretty much every social media platform, and probably nothing comes out on the 4th of July. So I think hopefully by the time you're listening to this, it will be out in the shops. I would love you to buy it from, an independent bookshop, but mostly I would just love you to buy it from wherever is easy for you. And it's out in hardback and ebook and audiobook, and there will be a paperback at some point as well in the future. And yeah, I just really hope that people enjoy it and resonate with it. And it is hopefully kind of a light and comic read, but it does sort of delve into quite a few dark themes as well. So I really hope there's a bit of something in there for everybody.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's been really great to chat. I feel like I've had a free therapy session. So thank you, Chloe.